Camden Prescott's fingers drove under Eli Navarro's jaw and clamped around his throat, pinning him against the frozen intake gate hard enough to rattle the steel links, while his boots skidded on black ice and found nothing to push against. Air narrowed to a tube the width of a straw. Eli's hands went to Camden's wrist out of reflex, thin knuckles white, gloves half torn at the fingertips. He tried to wedge 2 fingers between skin and grip the way a medic had once shown him, years ago, long before the headaches and the balance spells and the shelter forms stamped "Denied" for canine. Camden leaned in closer and smiled through perfect teeth, expensive cologne and bourbon breath mixing with the metal smell of winter. "Say it," Camden said. "Say you don't belong here." Eli tried to answer. What came out was a scraped sound and fog. His right shoulder hit the gate again. Chain links bit through his coat. The brass sign above the sliding hospital door caught security light and threw it downward in cold gold. Prescott Winter, Shelter, in partnership with Prescott Memorial. A name on the building. A name in his windpipe. Vandal launched from Eli's left with a hoarse bark that broke into a growl halfway through, tan and black body low and fast despite the limp he hid when anyone looked too long. He hit Camden at knee height. Not full force, more warning than bite, and Camden answered with the sharp, practiced cruelty of someone who had done this before. His designer sneakers snapped into Vandal's ribs with a hard crack that bounced off concrete and glass. The dog yelped once, stumbled, then planted again. 19 people stood behind the heated corridor glass and watched. A transport orderly in fresh scrubs froze with a coffee cup halfway to his mouth. 2 interns in blue shoe covers stood shoulder to shoulder and stared like they were waiting for a screen to buffer. A man in a wool overcoat took one quick look, then lifted his phone and pretended to read weather updates. A volunteer with a church lanyard pressed herself against the wall near the vending machines and did not move. Nobody opened the door. Camden's friend Jace filmed from 6 feet away, camera light on, laughter wet and breathless. "Prescott, cleanup crew at work," he said to his stream. "Night shift sanitation. We're taking out the drifters." He swung the phone so the brass sign appeared in frame, then swung back to Eli's face, turning dark at the edges. Comments rolled, hearts floated. Jace laughed harder. Eli's ears filled with a rushing sound. Not wind, blood. His left knee folded and righted and folded again. He could feel the old TBI warning, white sparks at the corners, delayed depth, distance sliding sideways. He had learned to ride those moments out by finding one point and holding it. Tonight he found Vandal's ear, torn edge, faded tattoo inside, a letter, a number, ghosted by time. Camden squeezed harder. "You hear me?" Camden said. "This place is for people who follow rules. Dog stays out. You stay out. You sleep where the trash sleeps." Vandal moved between them again, slower now, chest tight, paws scraping salt grit. He showed teeth but kept his body angled toward Eli, guarding more than attacking. Camden shifted weight and kicked him a second time, lower, catching flank and old scar tissue. The sound was duller this time, a thud into muscle and pain. A nurse at the corridor window turned her ID badge inward so her name disappeared, then looked down at her clipboard with careful concentration, pen hovering above a blank line. She did not call security. She did not call anyone. She became very busy with paper. Eli clawed at Camden's sleeve, the logo patch expensive and clean. "Please," he whispered, or thought he did. His throat burned hot and raw. "He's all I got." Camden's eyes stayed flat. He wore $400 sunglasses at 3 a.m, perched on his head like a crown. "Then you got nothing," he said. Jace zoomed in. "Look at this guy. He's crying." Eli wasn't crying. His eyes were watering from pressure. Tears and pain looked the same on camera. Snow started again, fine and dry, crossing the loading dock in slanted lines under the floodlights. The intake buzzer stayed silent. Inside, heat vents hummed. Outside, Eli's fingers numbed through wool, then through skin. He had spent 3 months at that gate and learned the rhythms. Meal van at 6, intake clerk at 7, security rotation every 2 hours, wind strongest between 1 and 4. He knew where the concrete kept a little warmth from buried pipes. He knew which corner blocked the north gust. He knew exactly how long a protein bar lasted when split in two. Tonight, he also learned how long 19 people could watch and do nothing. Camden shifted his grip and shoved Eli sideways. Eli's temple clipped the gatepost with a flat sound and bright flash. He slid halfway down, one boot twisted under him, breath finally ripping in, ragged and thin. Camden followed, caught his jacket collar, hauled him upright again with one hand. "I said no dogs," Camden snapped. "You make me repeat myself?" Vandal's growl changed. Lower. Rolling. Not loud, but steady. Like thunder held behind a mountain. He stood on 3 good lines and one shaking one, shoulder canted, eyes locked on Camden's wrist. Saliva threaded from his lip to the ice. His coat was dark as iron under the security lights. Jace kept filming. "Do it again," he said to Camden. "Kick him again. Chat loves it." Inside the corridor, someone finally touched the intercom button and released it without speaking. A short burst of static hissed over the gate speaker, then cut. No words. No help. Eli tasted blood where he had bitten the inside of his cheek. Memory flickered where oxygen thinned. A blast wall in Kandahar. Sand in his teeth. A medic shouting his name. Then this winter gate returned. Brass letters above him. Camden's hand at his throat. Vandal limping in circles because he refused to leave. "Last warning," Camden said. "Surrender the mutt, or lose your spot forever." "There is no spot," Eli rasped. Camden laughed once, sharp and offended, and slammed Eli back against the gate. Chain links clattered. Pain traveled up Eli's spine and into the base of his skull, where old injury lived. His vision narrowed again. He felt Vandal press against his shin, felt the dog's body tremble with cold and strain and fury. 19 witnesses. Heated hall, fluorescent light. Not one set of footsteps toward the door. A respiratory therapist in purple scrubs took 2 steps closer to the glass, saw Camden glance over, and stepped back so fast her shoulder struck the supply cart. She mouthed something to the unit clerk. The clerk shook her head without looking up from the computer. Camden noticed the movement and smiled for the audience behind glass. "See?" he said, loud enough for everyone. "Policy's policy." He liked saying that word. Policy. It made cruelty sound procedural. Eli tried to keep his feet under him. His right boot slid, sole worn flat at the heel. He put his palm to the gate to steady himself and felt frost bite through leather. Vandal pressed harder against his leg, then lurched forward with a bark that cracked in the middle, pain slicing it thin. Camden's knee came up, blocked the dog's chest, and shoved him back. Vandal staggered, claws scratching for grip, then came forward again because retreat had never been in him. Jace panned to the corridor crowd. "Look at them," he said, laughing. "Nobody wants the smoke." He was right. Nobody wanted trouble with Prescott money. The family name sat on the pediatric wing, the scholarship fund, the police training annex 2 miles down the road. In this town, you could almost map fear by brass plaques. Eli's hands shook from cold and oxygen debt. He tried one more time to pry Camden's fingers loose, and Camden responded with bored efficiency, tightening grip until Eli's pulse hammered against his own skin. Darkness nipped at the edges. Sound flattened. The only thing still sharp was Vandal's breathing, rough and fast, and the tiny tag at his collar rings striking metal with each movement. Tick, tick, tick. A man in security black stood 20 feet inside the door, radio in hand, jaw tight. He looked to the nurse with the turned badge. She looked away first. He set the radio back on his belt and stayed where he was. Nobody helped. Camden leaned close enough that Eli could see the faint razor burn along his jawline. "You people think sacrifice buys you something," he said. "It doesn't." Vandal bared his teeth fully this time and shifted his weight forward, injured side quivering. Eli saw it happen a fraction before Camden did. Ears pinned, muscles loading, decision made. Eli tried to say the dog's name to call him back, to keep him from another kick he could not absorb. Only a broken whisper came out. The elevator at the far end of the corridor chimed, a single clean tone that cut through laughter, through static, through wind against glass, and several heads turned at once toward the VA transfer doors as they began to open. The VA transfer doors parted in slow mechanical inches, and cold hallway light slid across tile, as if the corridor itself had taken one careful breath. Then Atlas moved. He came through first, 85 pounds of tan and black shepherd muscle and scar tissue, his coat catching the fluorescent glare in bands that looked gold for a second, and then dark as forged iron when he crossed into shadow. His ears rotated forward and locked. His body went rigid before his handler cleared the threshold. A low sound started in his chest, not loud, not theatrical, just steady pressure, like distant thunder rolling over frozen ground. The sound reached the intake gate faster than words would have. Trey Clark stepped out right behind him in NWU Type 3 camouflage, sleeves down, collar squared, boots wet from tracked-in sleet. He looked like work, not performance, 6 feet of old discipline and held-back fatigue. Dark hair cut short enough to ignore, gray beginning at the temples, jawline marked by a pale scar that ran from beneath his right ear to the corner of his chin. His hands were bare despite the cold, knuckles cross-hatched with healed cuts, left thumb wrapped once in black tape. He had a duffel strap over one shoulder and Atlas's leash loose in his right hand, not because he trusted the room, but because he trusted the dog. Camden still had Eli by the throat when he glanced over. That was the moment the corridor changed shape. It happened in tiny movements first. The transport orderly set down his coffee cup without taking a sip. The respiratory therapist in purple scrubs stepped toward the glass again, and did not retreat this time. The security officer 20 feet inside the door touched his radio and kept his fingers there. Even Jace's phone drifted off Eli's face for one uncertain second, camera finding the man in camouflage and the dog that looked like a military memory nobody wanted in their frame. Atlas stopped exactly 10 feet from Camden, paws planted wide on slick concrete, head low, eyes fixed on the hand at Eli's throat. He did not bark. He did not lunge. He held. Eli dragged one raw inhale through the space Camden's grip allowed and felt two things at once. Pain burning his airway and recognition so sharp it almost replaced pain. The shepherd in front of him carried himself like trained service stock, not pet stock. Weight centered, shoulders quiet, no wasted motion. The kind of dog that had listened for tripwires and breathing patterns and small mechanical sounds men missed. Eli knew that posture in his bones because Vandal had once moved exactly that way before paperwork stripped his name down to canine hold and a shelter clerk called him a liability. Vandal's response was immediate. His ears snapped forward. His trembling changed, not gone, but redirected. He limped one step closer to Eli's shin, then angled his body toward Atlas and gave one short chuff through clenched teeth, a hard little sound that meant alert, not fear. Atlas answered with a single blink and the faintest shift of weight onto his rear legs. Working dogs spoke in inches. Camden tightened reflexively, fingers digging deeper as if pressure could restore control. "Back up," he said, voice cracking just enough to betray the first fracture. "This is shelter intake. You don't get to—" Trey said nothing. He did not hurry. He did not posture. He looked once at Eli's neck, once at Vandal's ribs, once at Jace's raised phone, and once at the brass sign above the door. His gaze lingered on Prescott, long enough for anyone watching to understand he had read every letter. Atlas's growl deepened by one note when Camden shifted his right foot like he was considering another kick. 19 witnesses were still behind glass, but they were not statues now. The nurse who had turned her badge inward straightened and reached for the wall phone with a hand that shook. The volunteer with the church lanyard stepped away from the vending machines and put herself between two interns and the door as if bracing to open it. The man in the wool overcoat lowered his phone and stared openly, weather updates forgotten. A unit clerk finally looked up from her monitor and met the security officer's eyes. Fear had been organized in that building for years. In one corridor minute, it began to disorganize. Jace laughed again, too loud. "What? Camouflage guy wants a hero moment?" The laugh landed flat. No one joined in. Eli's vision still tunneled at the edges, but he saw Trey's eyes clearly now. And what he saw there was not rage, not panic, not uncertainty. It was the calm of someone who had already mapped every angle in front of him and filed each of them under outcomes. Camden saw it too and mistook it for hesitation, the way men like him always did when consequence walked in. Wearing no jewelry and no raised voice, Vandal tried to stand taller and failed halfway, weight buckling over his injured side. Eli felt the dog press harder against his leg to stay upright. He tasted iron at the back of his throat and heard the tiny collar tag tick against metal again. Tick, tick, tick. Atlas's ears twitched at that sound and then settled forward, attention narrowing to Camden's wrist. The elevator doors slid shut behind Trey, with a soft hydraulic seal that sounded, in that moment, like a lock engaging. Camden looked at the corridor glass, searching for backup from habit. His face shifted when he saw uncertainty looking back at him. He jerked Eli once, mean and performative, and tried to reset the old script. "Policy," he snapped, loud enough for the witnesses. "No animals. He refuses compliance. We're documenting." Jace lifted his phone higher and panned between Camden, Eli, Vandal, Trey, Atlas, the brass sign. "You all seeing this?" he said to his stream. This drifter brought reinforcements. Trey still said nothing. He took one step forward. Atlas matched him, shoulder to knee, leash slack, growl now a vibration in the air, more than a sound. Inside the corridor, the security officer keyed his radio. "Need supervisor at winter intake now," he said, voice clipped. "Assault in progress, animal injury, possible media capture." The words floated through the speaker grill and broke something loose in the room. The nurse with the turned badge hit the emergency call button. A red indicator light flashed above the inner desk. The volunteer shoved the outer door bar down with both hands, cracked it open 3 inches, then 5. Warm air spilled into the cold, carrying disinfectant and stale coffee and institutional fear. Camden heard the radio call, and his jaw tightened. "You don't know who you're talking to," he said, still aimed at Trey, still trying to reclaim the old gravity where his surname bent people around him. "My family runs this place." Trey's expression did not change. Eli felt Camden's grip falter by half a pound. It was enough to draw a fuller breath, enough for oxygen to re-enter his thoughts in jagged pieces. He recognized Trey's uniform first, then Atlas's harness, then the old ache that came with military cadence in civilian spaces. Not safety yet, but the shape of it. Snow hissed against the loading dock lights. Somewhere down the corridor, an alarm chirped and stopped. The brass plaque above the sliding doors gleamed like a threat written in polished metal. Atlas stared at Camden's hand until even Jace's camera shook. Right there, at the edge where violence paused and consequence had not yet spoken, hold this with us for a moment. Tell us where you're watching from, because stories like this travel farther than any one town's fear. Subscribe if you believe veterans and service dogs are not disposable line items, and stay with this to sunrise, because before morning that family name above the door would stop functioning as a shield. The corridor stayed suspended in that hard, thin second after the ask, every person feeling the same arithmetic and pretending they were not. One hand on a veteran's throat, one injured dog trying to stand, one former SEAL and one decorated shepherd holding the line. 19 witnesses deciding who they were going to be when this minute became record. Eli's knees shook. He kept one hand on Vandal's shoulder to steady them both and felt heat under fur where Camden's sneaker had landed. Not broken, he prayed. Bruised, maybe cracked, but not broken. Vandal's breathing was shallow and fast, each inhale hitching, each exhale edged with a soft rumble that never left Camden's wrist. Eli whispered his name without sound. Vandal flicked one ear toward him and stayed in guard position anyway. Jace's stream comments were still rolling. Hearts had slowed. New text flashed faster than he could read. Someone had clipped the feed and reposted it. Someone had tagged the hospital account. Someone else wrote, "Security call 911" in all caps. Jace squinted, suddenly less amused, thumb hovering over the end button and not pressing it. Inside the half-open door, the security officer moved out to the threshold, palm up in a keep-distance gesture nobody trusted. "Sir," he said to Camden, voice thin with protocol, "release him now." Camden snapped his head toward the guard with disbelief so pure it was almost childlike. "Do you know my name?" The guard swallowed. "Yes." "Then do your job." "My job," the guard said with a glance at Trey and then at Eli's bruising throat, "is documenting assault." He lifted his body camera from standby and the small green light turned solid. There were moments when systems corrected themselves by policy memo and committee vote. This was not one of those moments. This was correction by witness, by file creation, by people deciding to stop looking away while the right pair of boots and the right pair of paws stood in front of a gate. Trey shifted one more step, close enough now that Camden had to tilt his chin to keep eye contact, and Atlas's growl cut out abruptly, replaced by complete silence so focused it felt louder than sound. The dog's hackles stayed high. His tail stayed neutral. His eyes never blinked. Eli felt a strange, fractured clarity break through the oxygen haze. Atlas was military, no doubt. And Vandal, even hurt, was answering him with old protocols too precise to fake. Two dogs reading each other like coded traffic. Two histories about to collide under a plaque that had hidden too much for too long. Through the glass, the nurse who had hidden her badge pressed a stack of printed forms to her chest and stepped fully into view. Her face was gray with the kind of fear that comes from finally choosing. She looked at Trey, then Eli, then Vandal, and gave one short nod like a person signing her name to whatever came next. At the far end of the corridor, two more hospital security staff appeared at a jog, winter jackets unzipped, one carrying a tablet for incident intake. Behind them came an older woman in navy scrubs with a veteran pin on her lanyard, silver hair tied back tight, eyes fixed on Eli's throat before anything else. She did not slow when she reached the threshold. She walked past Camden's shoulder as far as his arm allowed and said to Eli, "Stay with me. Keep breathing." Camden still had his hand on Eli. But he was no longer alone with his power, and he was no longer unseen. The older nurse's fingers found Eli's wrist for a pulse, and in that suspended second where Camden still held his throat, and nobody breathed right, the story pulled backward to where this started. Now let's go back to the beginning. Eli Navarro was 41, Army once, line cook never, dishwasher when his balance held, and patient number C7-114 at the VA neurology desk when he could make it across town without the world tilting under him. The traumatic brain injury came from a rollover outside Gardez 13 years earlier, a convoy truck caught in a blast wave that didn't kill him and didn't let him go. It left him with migraines that came like weather fronts, bright edges around door frames and sudden drops in depth perception that turned curbs into traps. On good days, he could carry bus tubs stacked to his chin and joke with prep staff while steam coated the dish pit windows. On bad days, he reached for a plate that looked 6 inches away and found empty air, then stood very still till the room settled and nobody noticed. He rented a room by the week over a laundromat until the owner sold the building in late August and raised every tenant out with 30 days' notice and a printed apology. Eli packed in one night, a duffel with 2 uniforms from kitchen jobs, 1 army fleece with the name tape half torn off, a pill organizer, and a dented tin where he kept paperwork in freezer bags so rain couldn't erase him. The tin mattered. DD 214 copy, VA referral slips, 2 pay stubs, a photograph curled at the corners from being unfolded too often, 4 men in dust-stiff gear, grinning at nothing, sun behind them, one of them wearing a handler leash across his chest. By the second week of September, he was sleeping in the recessed loading alcove behind a closed pharmacy, boots tucked under his knees so no one could steal them while he slept. He met Vandal 3 nights later near the freight ramp behind a grocery distributor, where heat leaked from industrial vents and drew strays, men, and things people threw away. The dog came out of shadow without barking. Tan and black saddleback coat, gone dull with dust, left ear nicked, ribs visible under winter-thick fur that had not finished growing in. He stood 10 feet away and watched Eli unwrap a protein bar like it was a ritual he recognized. Eli tossed half. The dog sniffed, waited, then ate in quick, controlled bites. No begging, no snatching, no panic. Trained restraint. Eli had seen it around military working dogs on joint bases, the way hunger never erased discipline all the way. The next night the dog was there again, and the night after that, and by the time Frost started collecting on the loading dock rails, the animal had become a fact of Eli's life, as fixed as pain and weather. Eli named him Vandal, because the first shelter volunteer who saw the dog muttered, "Looks like he got tagged by the world." Eli didn't tell her he had already found the faded tattoo inside the ear, letters and numbers gone blurry but still arranged in a format civilians didn't use. He didn't tell her because men with clipboards heard tattoo and said ownership dispute. And ownership disputes ended with kennels, and kennels ended with separation. Eli had lost enough without offering up one more thing. Their routine became military in its precision. Eli filled water first and set the bowl down before he drank. He fed Vandal first and ate whatever remained. He checked paws, then hips, then flank. Under security lights, the shepherd's coat turned dark as iron, but at dawn the same fur flashed gold along the shoulders, and for 10 minutes each morning the dog looked less like survival and more like memory. Eli talked to him during the worst headache spikes, because spoken rhythm helped him track time when nausea blurred it. 1 breath, 2, 3. Vandal leaned his weight against Eli's shin until the world steadied. He never tied the dog up. At Prescott Winter Shelter Intake, Policy sat in a laminated binder beside a jar of pens chained to the counter. Rule 11. B. No animals inside sleeping dormitories. Rule 11C. Service animals accepted with verified documentation and prior approval from Program Director. Rule 11D. Unverified canines transferred to municipal holding pending disposition. The clerk on Eli's first night tapped the page with a polished nail and said, "Surrender him for 72 hours and maybe we can discuss reevaluation." She said maybe like a locked door. Eli asked where municipal holding was. She gave him an address and did not look him in the eye. He knew that building. Concrete runs, wire fencing, intake euthanasia timelines posted on a clipboard by the mop sink. He had washed trays there once on a church service day and heard dogs cry until his hands shook. He folded the form in half and slid it back untouched. 3 days passed before a case manager from the Veterans Outreach Office found him outside the intake gate and tried again with softer words and a thermal blanket. "Come in tonight," she said. "I'll make calls in the morning." Eli asked whether she could guarantee the dog stayed with him. She looked toward the brass plaque and said nothing for 2 full beats. Eli handed the blanket back. She left it anyway and cried in her car with the engine running. Eli watched the exhaust drift under the floodlights and stayed on the concrete, with Vandal pressed along his side for warmth. People said he was refusing help. That phrase spread fast because it made everyone else feel cleaner. He was not refusing help. He was refusing separation. His part-time dish shifts at Cedar Bend Family Grill kept them alive for a while. 4 nights a week, 5 hours if the dinner rush held, cash plus 1 takeout container. The owner pretended not to notice him packing. Eli stood at the dish machine where heat and noise hid his dizziness, and when vertigo hit, he braced his palm against stainless steel and kept moving. Forks, pans, trays, rinse, stack. The teenage busser, Naya, stopped asking about the bruises on Eli's shins after he fell once carrying stock and laughed it off before she could call an ambulance. She started wrapping leftovers in 2 containers instead of 1 without saying why. 1 for him, 1 for the dog. By early October, temperature dropped below freezing most nights. Eli scavenged cardboard sheets from appliance dumpsters and layered them under a military poncho to block ground cold. He cut an old wool sock into strips and wrapped Vandal's front paw where the pad had split. He warmed canned stew in a coffee tin over a sterno flame cupped between bricks, then let it cool enough for the dog first. When rain froze into sleet, Vandal angled his body to take the wind side. When Eli's headaches stole language, Vandal pressed his head into Eli's chest until his breathing evened out. Not pet affection, anchoring behavior, purposeful. A retired respiratory therapist named June, who volunteered nights at intake, began slipping Eli single-use heat packs and peanut butter crackers through the side gate when cameras were pointed toward the main doors. She did it with the speed of someone who had worked around policy long enough to know exactly how long Mercy could stay invisible. One night she whispered, "That dog's not random." Eli answered, "No, ma'am." She said, "I figured." By the first snow, Eli had memorized every crack in the intake concrete and every shift change face inside the glass. He knew who looked away from shame and who looked away from fear. He learned which security guard would quietly leave the side spigot, unfrozen for 10 extra minutes, and which one would threaten trespass to impress supervisors. He learned that hunger and humiliation could be scheduled, documented, and justified with institutional language until cruelty looked like administration. He also learned Vandal never slept deeply. Even on the rare warm nights when Eli dozed against the wall, the shepherd stayed in light sleep cycles. ears rotating at each elevator chime, each rolling gurney, each laugh too loud after midnight. Former MWD behaviors sat in that vigilance like old wiring no one had removed. Eli didn't have training manuals for it, but he recognized devotion when he saw it. That was why he stayed. Camden Prescott was 24, born into polished brass and board votes, and he treated the shelter corridor like a private hallway in a house his family paid to own. His father, Martin Prescott, chaired Prescott Memorial Hospital and sat on 3 state healthcare committees where contracts were discussed over catered lunches. His mother, Elaine Prescott, ran the foundation that funded winter shelter expansion, domestic violence grants, and the glossy annual gala where donors clapped for compassion beneath chandeliers. Their surnames sat on the pediatric wing, the research annex, and the police training building across the river. In Cedar Ridge, Prescott was less a family than a permitting process. Camden learned early that rules had hinges for people like him. At 16, he sideswiped a parked truck outside a high school fundraiser and left the scene. The report listed weather-related visibility concerns, and no citation followed. At 19, he filmed himself spraying beer over a sleeping man behind a bus terminal and posted it with laughing captions. The video vanished in 12 hours, and the account that reposted it got legal notices by morning. At 23, he shoved a veteran volunteer against a supply cart during a toy drive argument, and internal security classified it as mutual verbal escalation after reviewing incomplete footage. Nothing touched him for long, not because nothing happened, because systems caught impact before it reached him. He wore wealth like a warning label. Leather jacket in the weather too cold for leather, designer sneakers with soles too clean for ice, a stainless watch worth 3 months of Eli's pay when Eli had pay. $400 sunglasses at 3 in the morning because normal rules about sun and darkness belong to other people. He traveled with friends who treated cruelty as content strategy. Always one phone up, always one laugh ready, always sure no one in uniform would contradict a Prescott narrative if they valued their schedule, their grant, their promotion, their mortgage. 2 weeks before the gate assault, Camden came through intake with Jace and another man in a varsity coat and announced he was auditing compliance. He walked the line of cots and pointed at men's boots as if inspecting livestock, then ordered staff to remove anyone smelling like liquor, even when no tests were run. A nursing assistant protested. Camden said, "My mother funds your salary." The assistant was reassigned to day shift by Friday. 5 nights later, Eli watched Camden laugh while a security guard confiscated blankets from 3 men sleeping under the overhang because property standards required clear walkways for donor tours. Snow was coming down in hard diagonal streaks. One of the men was 70 and used oxygen tubing under his coat. Camden filmed the removal and called it housekeeping. The next day, the shelter newsletter ran a photo of Elaine Prescott handing out scarves. 3 days after that, a volunteer submitted an incident form about Camden kicking a dog bowl across the pavement and threatening to blacklist any staff member who fed unregistered animals. The form entered the electronic system at 2:14. By 9:03, it was marked resolved with no action. Eli saw the volunteer at dusk, eyes red, badge gone. "I was told to take a break," she said. She never came back. Even police calls bent around the same gravity. Dispatch logs showed unable to locate complainant when complainants stood under floodlights. Deputies arrived without body cameras active, spoke to Camden first, and left with cautions issued to everyone equally. Equal blame was the town's preferred solvent. It dissolved responsibility faster than accusation ever could. Meanwhile, Foundation money-funded training seminars on dignity and brochures with smiling veterans sat in acrylic racks 10 feet from the door where those veterans were turned away for bringing the only creature that kept them alive through the night. Eli heard all of it because invisibility had one advantage. People talked in front of him, as if he were already gone. Intake clerks whispered about directors' calls. Security staff muttered about reports rerouted upstairs. Drivers on smoke breaks listed which judges donated to which annual campaigns. The map of protection wasn't hidden. It was public, laminated, and repeated until it sounded normal. By the last week of November, Camden had begun stopping by after bars closed, hunting for a scene, testing whether fear still moved on command when he snapped his fingers. It did. Until the night, it didn't. Until the night it didn't. And that break in the pattern had started 34 minutes earlier on the 7th floor of Prescott Memorial, where Trey Clark stood under humming fluorescent lights outside the VA Neurology step-down unit, with Atlas at heel and a discharge packet folded in his left hand. The hallway smelled like disinfectant, overheated plastic, and the burnt coffee that lived forever in hospital warmers after midnight. Trey had been awake since 100 hours, not because of duty, because sleep still came to him in short tactical windows and ended with his heart trying to outrun whatever memory had followed him out of Yemen. 90 minutes if he was lucky, 40 if he wasn't. He wore NWU Type 3 even off post because the fabric gave him edges, pockets, structure, and because civilian jackets made him feel exposed in ways gunfire never had. A corpsman in his unit once called it armor for the nervous system. Trey never argued, he just kept putting it on. Atlas sat without command, head up, eyes tracking every intersection in the corridor. Trey's hand rested lightly on the shepherd's neck, thumb moving over old scar tissue, beneath fur where a harness had rubbed through skin years earlier. He had the old jawline scar under his right ear and the newer ache in his left shoulder from a fast rope landing gone wrong near Al Hudaida. Neither bothered him as much as silence. Silence was where Owen Pike still talked. "Your pressure's high again," said Dr. Miriam Hale, the night attending with steel-gray hair braided tight down her back. She handed him a paper cup and 2 tablets he was already tired of taking. "You can keep pretending you're fine, Senior Chief, but your body is documenting something else." "Retired, Chief," Trey said. "Your nervous system did not retire." She lowered her voice and glanced at Atlas. Neither did his. Trey swallowed the tablets dry. "Transfer downstairs is clear? Room on hold at the VA Annex. Elevator keycards in your packet." She paused, looked at the scar on his jaw, then at his eyes. "You called out in your sleep in Bay 3. He kept his face still. "What name?" She knew better than to soften it. "Pike." For a second, the hallway tilted into heat and rotor wash and radio static. Yemen had been all angles and dust and hard decisions timed to fractions. Their element had stacked on a compound wall just before dawn, Atlas and Vandal both on lead lines, and Trey had made the call to breach on a window count that looked clean on ISR and wrong in real life. The first blast went where it should. The second came from underneath, pressure plate in a drainage channel nobody caught. Owen Pike took the shock on his right side and still managed to drag 2 civilians clear before he went down. Trey remembered the sound of his own voice on comms, flat and controlled, ordering medevac while blood and sand turned the same color under red light. He remembered Pike gripping his wrist and saying one sentence through broken breath, "Don't let them separate Vandal." Trey had said, "I won't." Pike died 19 minutes later in the Bird. By mid-December after retirement, Trey had stopped trying to sleep in his bed and started sleeping on the floor beside Atlas's crate, with one hand against the metal bars, because waking with physical contact to something living cut the panic time in half. He had fought for Atlas, the way some men fought lawsuits and some fought wars, one form and one signature at a time. The disposition office wanted to classify Atlas for limited demonstration duty because his detection scores were still elite despite the limp. A contractor offered to buy him for private security exhibitions. Trey sat in a windowless office at Naval Amphibious Base, Coronado, with 3 binders of medical records and said no until his voice went rough. He cited service regulation, handler recommendation, post-deployment stress indicators, and operational bond continuity. He filed appeals when requests vanished. He drove to Fort Sailor Disposition Center twice in 1 week when someone marked a box incorrectly and reflagged Atlas as pending reassignment. He slept in his truck outside the gate one night when admin told him to come back Monday. A chief warrant officer finally tossed him a pen and said, "You know this is a dog, right?" Trey signed the final transfer page and answered, "You know he found kids under concrete in Kandahar, right?" That was the end of the argument. The end of that argument, anyway. Vandal was the one he couldn't find. After Pike's death, Trey had requested Vandal's status through official channels, then unofficial channels, then the channels people used when official ones started lying. First answer, rehabilitation hold. Second answer, medical non-deployable. Third answer, 9 months later, euthanized after behavioral decline, paperwork complete. He remembered staring at that line item in a records office that smelled like printer toner and old carpet, while Atlas lay against his boot and watched his face. The date stamp was wrong. The handler's signature field was blank. Billing codes routed through a civilian contractor subsidiary with foundation ties in Cedar Ridge, where Prescott money sat in healthcare and procurement both. Trey flagged it. The flag disappeared. He filed again. No response. He kept the copy in a freezer bag with Pike's last letter. At 2:47 a.m., as Trey and Atlas waited for the VA transfer elevator, orderly wheels rattled over cracked tile, and a veteran in oxygen tubing rolled past under 2 blankets. Trey stepped aside automatically, scanning exits, corners, hands, shoes. Hypervigilance was what clinicians called it. To him, it felt like unfinished work. Atlas leaned once into his thigh, then straightened when he heard raised voices echoing faint from the intake corridor 2 floors down. Trey heard only noise at first. Atlas heard intent. The shepherd's ears rotated forward. His body locked. A low growl built in his chest. Trey touched 2 fingers to Atlas's collar. "Show me." When the elevator arrived, they entered with the security escort assigned to overnight transfers. A junior officer named Ben Ruiz with a body camera, clipped but not active and nerves visible in every movement. Ben glanced at Atlas's scarred hip and said, "He always this tuned in?" "Only when he has a reason," Trey said. Ben forced a laugh that died quickly. "Intake's rough tonight. Prescott kids down there again?" Trey looked up. "Camden?" Ben blinked. "You know him?" "I know the name on the building." Ben shifted his weight. "People keep filing complaints. They don't stick." The elevator descended with a soft hydraulic hum. Floor numbers glowed down in red. Atlas stood facing the doors, tail level, breathing measured but tight. Trey felt the old operational calm settle over him. That cold narrowing where fear got filed and function took over. It never felt heroic. It felt like grief doing math. By the time the car passed level 3, Atlas gave one short, alert chuff and angled his head left, toward the intake corridor and away from the loading dock. Trey smelled winter air before the doors opened, and beneath that he caught another scent that pulled him backward years in an instant. Shepherd, male, old training soap, scar tissue, stress hormones, and the faint metallic trace of a military ear tattoo, cleaned with poor water and no clinic. "Another dog," Ben said. "Former working dog," Trey answered. The doors opened on level 2 and the sound hit full force. Laughter sharp as broken glass, a man choking, chain links rattling, a phone camera recording too close. Atlas moved first, one controlled step into the corridor, body rigid and silent, and Trey saw it all in one scan. Camden's hand at Eli's throat, Eli's knees going, the brass plaque, 19 people behind glass, and a tan and black shepherd trying to hold a guard line through pain. Trey recognized the gate before he saw the ear. Not pet gate. Not random stray compensation. This was trained offset movement from an old left side impact, weight redistributed with discipline through injury. He had watched Vandal move like that through debris fields in Marja and alleyways in Mukalla, shoulders low, eyes hard, checking Pike's blind side before Pike asked. When Camden kicked the dog, the animal didn't break contact with the threat. He folded, reset, guarded the handler. Military behavior under civilian cruelty. Atlas gave a deeper growl and leaned forward until his front paws were exactly on the seam, where tile met concrete, the line between institution and exposure. 48 months old at first deployment. 4 deployments total. 17 civilians located after blast events in Afghanistan and Yemen, including 6 children under a collapsed school annex near Lashkar Gah. One interdiction in Kandahar, where Atlas detected command wire under fresh gravel 30 seconds before a convoy rolled across. The blast still came from a secondary device hidden in a wall breach, and shrapnel tore through his left hip during the extraction run. He finished the route anyway. He collapsed only after the team reached cover. Medical reports called it retained fragment burden with chronic mobility limitation. Trey called it the reason Atlas favored stairs and hated polished floors. Atlas had earned 2 campaign streamers, 1 Valor Commendation listed under his unit citation, and a retirement note written in dry, bureaucratic language that never once mentioned the way he pressed his head to Trey's chest on nights when nightmares turned breathing into work. Vandal's file was harder to build because someone had tried to erase it. But Trey knew the pieces by heart. German Shepherd, MWD certified, handler Owen Pike. 3 deployments, 11 documented detections of explosives or weapons caches, 9 apprehensions without lethal force, 1 compound breach in Yemen where Vandal held a narrow corridor under small arms fire, long enough for 2 medics to drag casualties out. Then the paperwork fracture after Pike's death. Transfer marked, transfer revised, disposition completed, billing approved, dog missing, and now here he was under security lights outside a shelter with Prescott's name on the door, ribs kicked, ear tattoo faded, but legible if you knew where to look. Atlas's growl stopped when Trey put his hand on the back of his neck. Complete silence. Complete focus. Ben Ruiz swallowed and thumbed his body camera to active. Green light steady. "That's assault," he said, voice low and stunned as if speaking the truth out loud was its own kind of risk. "That's straight assault." "Keep it running," Trey said. 19 witnesses had watched the first part. The next part would have a record. At 2:59 a.m., with snow hissing against the loading dock lights and the intake door cracked open, just enough to spill heat onto ice, Trey stepped forward beside Atlas and felt something shift that had nothing to do with rank, money, or policy. It was older than that. A promise made in dust and rotor wash. A dog everyone said was gone breathing in front of him. A dead teammate's final sentence coming due. That was the exact second the night stopped belonging to Camden Prescott. Camden Prescott still had his hand on Eli Navarro's throat. But the corridor no longer belonged to the old script, where money spoke first and everyone else waited for permission to breathe. Eli felt that change before he could use it. Pain still burned from jaw to collarbone. His airway still narrowed when Camden's thumb shifted, and black flecks still gathered at the edge of his vision when he tried to draw a full breath. But now there was Atlas at the tile seam, silent and fixed, and Trey Clark one step behind him in wet camouflage, reading the room like a map he had trained on for years. Vandal pressed against Eli's shin, shaking through the ribs Camden had kicked, yet still angled toward the threat with the stubborn discipline of a dog built for one job and one handler. The older nurse in navy scrubs kept 2 fingers at Eli's wrist and spoke in a low, steady cadence. "Stay with me. In through your nose if you can. Small breaths." Her veteran pin caught the overhead light each time she shifted. She smelled like antiseptic and wintergreen hand cream, familiar and human in a space that had felt procedural a minute earlier. Eli followed her voice as best he could, holding to it the way he held to Vandal's ear tattoo during migraines, one fixed point against the spin. Inside the half-open door, 19 witnesses were still in place, but they were no longer frozen into silence. The transport orderly had his phone out and camera pointed at Camden's grip. One intern was crying and talking to someone on speaker, repeating location and injury details in clipped bursts. The volunteer with the church lanyard stood by the panic bar, so the door could not swing shut again. The nurse, who had hidden her badge, now held a thick stack of forms against her chest, knuckles pale, eyes locked on Camden, like she had decided fear had already taken enough from her. Jace tried to keep the rhythm of mockery alive and failed. "It's just intake enforcement," he said to his stream, voice higher than before. "He's non-compliant. You can see—" His words broke when comments started flooding faster than he could track. He glanced down, thumb hovering over the end button, then up at Trey, then down again. Ben Ruiz, body camera green and steady, took one step closer and made his voice carry. "Camden, release him. Now." Protocol words. Clear. Recordable. Camden did not release. He tightened. Eli's breath hitched. Vandal answered with a rough, low growl and tried to plant harder on his injured side. His left forepaw slipped on a patch of salt and ice, claws ticking concrete, then recovered. Atlas's ears pinned forward at the sound, and his chest expanded once, a measured intake that made his frame look larger without any sudden movement. At 3:01 a.m., snow hissed across the loading dock lights and melted in thin beads on Trey's boots. Camden jerked Eli upright by the throat and collar together, forcing him onto unsteady feet. "Policy's still policy," he snapped, eyes flicking toward the witnesses as if a slogan could rebuild control. "No dogs, no exceptions." Eli's voice came out scraped and thin. "He's service." "Unverified," Camden shot back. "That means stray." The word landed wrong in the corridor, and everyone felt it. Trey had already seen the tattoo in Vandal's ear. Eli had protected that dog for 3 months in sleet and sub-zero wind, because holding too often meant disposal. Ben's body cam was recording in high definition under hospital lights. The nurse with the forms took a step forward and finally spoke. "I filed 3 incident packets," she said, holding the stack up where Ben's camera could see. Her voice trembled, then steadied. "All involving him. All marked, resolved, without interview." Camden turned on her with open disbelief. "You don't get to speak to me." She met his stare and did not drop hers. "I just did." That was the first open fracture. The second came when Vandal shifted from guarding Eli's leg to locking on Camden's wrist. Even hurt, he made the same calculated line a trained MWD would make in a narrow hallway. Threat hand first, no wasted aggression, no panic bite. Atlas saw it and moved one half-step forward, shoulder aligned with Trey's knee. Two dogs reading the same problem, through different scars. Eli's knees buckled, then held. He pressed his palm against the Vandal's neck and felt fast heat under fur where the kick had landed. Not just pain, inflammation. He knew enough from field medics and cold nights to tell the difference. He whispered the dog's name, one syllable dragged through bruised tissue. Vandal's ear flicked back toward him, then forward again to Camden. Jace took 2 steps backward without noticing he had moved. His camera dipped and caught the brass plaque over the entrance. The family name bright and polished above an assault nobody could pretend not to see now. Inside the corridor, the unit clerk printed a second set of intake logs and walked them straight to Ben without asking permission. Camden's jaw tightened. "You're all making a career-ending mistake," he said, trying to project the old certainty. "My family funds this floor. My mother writes the grants that keep this shelter open." No one answered him. Trey did not blink. In Eli's oxygen-starved haze, details sharpened and held. The tape around Trey's thumb, Atlas's scarred hip line, Ben's camera light, the nurse's hand still at his pulse, and Vandal's collar tag, tapping once against metal with each strained breath. This was still the same gait, same cold, same hand on his throat. But now every person in that corridor had context. They knew Camden's history. They knew Trey's bearing was not theater. They knew Vandal was not random. The minute had changed because the truth inside it had changed. A hospital security supervisor reached the threshold carrying a tablet and stopped short when he saw Trey's uniform and Camden's grip. "Sir, let go," he said to Camden, voice tight. "This is being documented on multiple devices." Camden laughed once, sharp and brittle. "Document whatever you want." He did not let go. Trey stepped closer until he stood within arm's reach, Atlas rising with him in exact cadence, silent and high through the shoulders. Camden glanced at the dog, then back to Trey, and for the first time his confidence showed seams. He had spent years misreading discomfort as weakness and fear as consent. What he saw in Trey's face did not fit either category. It was calm without softness, focus without noise, the expression of someone who had stood in worse places than this and had not looked away there either. The corridor compressed to breath and distance. Trey spoke. "Let him go." 3 words. No volume spike, no threat display, just command. "Just," Camden answered on reflex, too fast, like he had recited this line his whole life. "My father owns this hospital." Trey's expression did not move. "Not this moment." Atlas rose another inch at Trey's side, weight forward but contained, a wall of trained intent. Vandal, chest heaving, mirrored the line from Eli's leg despite pain, eyes fixed on Camden's wrist, as if he could see the tendons and pressure points through skin. 2 military dogs in one corridor, both choosing restraint until given a reason not to. Even the people behind glass understood what that meant. Camden looked from one dog to the other and back to Trey. His hand shifted on Eli's throat. Not a release, just a recalculation. "Back your animal up," he said, voice thinner now. "Or I'll have both put down by sunrise," Ben said, loud enough for every microphone. "Threat noted on record," Jace whispered, almost to himself. "Camden, just drop him." Camden snapped, "Shut up." Then he made his mistake. He shoved Eli sideways toward the gate while pulling back with his other shoulder, trying to create space and spin away from the dogs at once. Eli's boots hit black ice. His head tipped toward the steel post. Trey moved before impact, left hand catching Eli's jacket at the sternum and guiding him down the gate line instead of into it, right forearm slicing between Camden's wrist and Eli's airway with precise pressure. No swing, no show. Just a clean separation executed by muscle memory honed in places where hesitation got people killed. Camden's grip broke. Air rushed into Eli's lungs in a ragged, burning pull that felt like swallowing fire. He coughed hard, folded at the waist, and the nurse in navy scrubs went with him, one hand bracing his shoulder, the other shielding his head from the gate. Atlas stepped through the new space and planted squarely between Camden and Eli, chest out, eyes locked, no bark. Vandal staggered once, then came to Eli's other side and held position, trembling but upright. Camden tried to surge forward anyway, leading with outrage more than balance. "You touched me," he hissed at Trey. "Do you understand what happens to people who touch me?" Trey held his ground. "Yes." A single word stopped Camden colder than shouting would have. He saw it then. Not just the scar at Trey's jaw or the uniform or the dog. He saw the arithmetic in Trey's eyes, the settled certainty that consequence had already been calculated and accepted. Men like Camden survived on Bluff because Bluff worked on people, afraid of fallout. Trey looked like a man who had lived inside fallout and kept moving. The tactic failed in real time, and Camden knew it. Security closed in from both sides, measured and fast. The supervisor took Camden's right arm. Ben took the left, camera still running. "You're being detained pending law enforcement," Ben said, voice formal, and shaking only at the edges. "Assault and animal cruelty investigation." "You can't detain me here," Camden snapped, twisting. "Call my father, right now." "Call log already started," the supervisor said. Inside the corridor, the nurse with the hidden badge handed her packet to the unit clerk, then to Ben, so the camera captured each page title: incident report, witness statement, intake override request, no action taken. She exhaled like someone surfacing after months underwater. Jace finally lowered his phone. "I'm done streaming," he muttered. Ben glanced at him. "Keep the file. Don't delete anything." Jace nodded once, color draining from his face. "I won't." Eli stayed crouched against the gate, coughing through pain. Vandal pressed along his side, and Atlas standing guard in front of both of them, with ears forward and tail level. Trey knelt beside Eli just long enough to check his pupils and neck bruising, then looked at Vandal's ear. He lifted the torn edge with careful fingers and found the faded tattoo line under the frost-stiff fur. For 1 second, Trey's control cracked at the eyes and nowhere else. He looked back at Eli. "You kept him alive." Eli swallowed against the swelling in his throat and managed a rough whisper. "He kept me." Trey gave one short nod, the kind passed between people who understood service without speech. Across the threshold, Camden was still protesting, still naming his father, still trying to summon the old shield with every breath. But the cameras were on, the witnesses were speaking, the forms were in hand, and 2 German shepherds stood in that corridor, like living evidence that the story had always been larger than a family name on brass. Camden twisted against the security hold and shouted into the corridor, "Call my father now!" while Ben Ruiz guided him toward the inner desk and kept the body camera pointed at his face, his hands, and the red marks on Eli's throat. The old nurse in navy scrubs didn't look up. She kept one palm between Eli's shoulder blades until his coughing slowed. Then she said, "Wheelchair," and an intern sprinted without waiting for permission. At 3:07 a.m., the 1st City Patrol Unit arrived at the loading dock, and the officer who stepped out was Deputy Nolan Hart, the same deputy who had closed 2 prior shelter calls as mutual disturbance. He took one look at Camden in restraints and started with the familiar script anyway. "Let's all calm this down. Misunderstanding at intake." "Assault in progress," Ben said, and turned his chest so the green camera light sat in the center of Hart's view. "Recorded start to finish. Victim is a veteran on VA transfer property. Animal injury documented. Witness count 19 plus live stream. Hart's mouth tightened. He looked past Ben toward Camden. Camden straightened and seized the line he always used. Nolan, take these cuffs off me. My father chairs this hospital. Trey stood beside Atlas and did not move. You say that again, he said. And it goes on record as coercion. Hart looked at Trey's uniform, then Atlas, then Vandal, then Eli's bruising. His radio chirped before he could answer. Dispatch came through sharp and formal. All units, hold scene. State investigator en route. VA police notified. Preserve evidence. That was the sound of one layer failing. Jace tried to edge toward the side exit with his phone at his thigh. Ben caught it. Stop. I'm not deleting, Jace said quickly. I swear, it auto-saved to cloud anyway. Good, Ben said. You'll unlock it in front of investigator. Jace did, hands shaking. The live stream, the raw file, the repost links, and the comment timestamps were mirrored to a forensic drive at the security desk by 3:19. The unit clerk printed the chain of custody label and read the serial number aloud while Ben's camera recorded. Evidence item B-14. Source device Jace Wilkes. Voluntary surrender. Complete upload confirmed. Jace signed with the stylus that skipped twice on the glass. That was another layer. The nurse who had turned her badge inward stepped up next. She set down her stack of forms, then added a flash drive from her pocket. These are the incident reports marked resolved, she said. These are the original drafts before edits. This folder has email responses from administration asking us to reclassify physical contact as policy enforcement. Hart stared at her. Why didn't you bring this before? Her jaw worked once. Because the last aide who did got moved off nights and lost her housing stipend in 10 days. She looked at Eli's throat, then at Vandal's ribs. I'm bringing it now. The state investigator arrived at 3:31, a woman in a wool coat with Department of Health compliance on her badge and no interest in local hierarchy. She took one sweep of the corridor and said, Nobody leaves until statements are recorded. She pointed to the brass sign above the door. Photograph that. Whole frame. A forensic tech from VA police photographed Eli's neck bruising, Vandal's flank, Camden's hands, Atlas's positioning marks in salt grit, the gate post, and the plaque with Prescott centered over the assault location. The static intercom hiss from earlier was retrieved from security audio logs. It captured the open line, then silence, then Camden saying policy. The unit clerk, who had tapped and released the button, admitted she had panicked and froze. Her statement was taken and filed, not buried. By 4:02, Dr. Miriam Hale came down from 7th floor in a winter coat over scrubs and handed the investigator a sealed copy of Trey's archived records request on Vandal. This was flagged 2 years ago, she said. No response. It belongs in this file now. Trey added his freezer bag copy of the disposition sheet with the blank handler signature and wrong date stamp. The investigator held it beside the nurse's flash drive printout and said, Same contractor code. Same billing route through Prescott Foundation grants. Camden heard that and went pale under the fluorescent lights. At 4:18, Martin Prescott arrived with 2 attorneys, cashmere overcoat open, anger calibrated for boardrooms. My son is being unlawfully detained, he said. I want every camera off. The investigator didn't raise her voice. You can wait with counsel in Conference B. Federal referral has been initiated for fraudulent euthanasia, billing, and records tampering tied to your foundation disbursements. Martin blinked once. That is absurd. She held up the disposition form and the audit log. Its document. He looked to Deputy Hart for rescue and got none. Hart had already signed the arrest worksheet under state supervision. That was the layer he could not buy back. By 5:40 a.m., facilities arrived with a lift and a wrench set, and under direct order from the interim compliance officer, they removed the brass Prescott plaque above intake as evidence and replaced it with a temporary white board that read, "Winter Shelter Entrance." No applause, no speeches, just bolts backing out one by one while dawn edged gray over the loading dock. Camden was transported at 6:05 on assault and animal cruelty charges. Martin Prescott was not in the hallway when they wheeled his son past. 3 days later, in a hearing room that smelled like copier toner and old coffee, Ben's body cam footage played on a wall screen, then Jace's stream, then the recovered incident reports, with edit histories showing who changed what and when. The receptionist, who had buried complaints, invoked policy, then admitted she had been directed by executive office aliases tied to foundation accounts. The respiratory therapist in purple scrubs testified, voice shaking. "I stepped back when I should have stepped in." The man in the wool coat never appeared and never answered subpoena service. The record noted non-cooperation. At the second hearing, VA contracting auditors testified that disposition payments were submitted for euthanasia procedures never performed, including one line item linked to Vandal's ID. The county prosecutor called it fraud against Federal Service animal programs. The board called it administrative irregularity, until the investigator read the full chain aloud and asked if they preferred conspiracy. They voted for resignations before lunch. Martin Prescott stepped down that afternoon. 27 days after the corridor assault, Trey stood with Eli and both dogs across the street while crews removed the Prescott name from the police training annex. Sparks jumped from the cutting wheel in short, bright arcs. Metal letters hit canvas dropcloth with hard, ringing knocks. Nobody tried to stop it. Vandal flinched at the first strike, then settled when Trey rested a hand on his neck. The next morning, at the State Veterans Committee chamber, Eli sat at the witness table in a donated blazer that still had a thrift store tag thread at one sleeve. His throat bruises had gone yellow at the edges. His voice stayed rough but steady. "They kept saying I refused help," he told the panel. "I refused separation. Different thing." Trey testified after him. NWU Type 3. Crisp despite no obligation to wear it. He placed both palms on the table and spoke in short lines that landed harder than long speeches. "No separation intake for verified veterans with working dog indicators. Immediate provisional housing. 48-hour documentation window. No municipal transfer pending review. If the dog has service markers, treat it like medical equipment attached to a person's survival." Atlas lay at his feet through the testimony, chin on paws, eyes on the room. Vandal lay beside Eli's chair, sore ribs still wrapped, ear tattoo photographed and entered as Exhibit 12. The motion passed before adjournment. At 4:16 p.m., Eli and Vandal entered Cedar Ridge Veteran Housing Unit, 3B under the new no-separation protocol, witnessed by the same Navy scrub nurse who had held his pulse at the gate. She handed Eli a key card and said, "Both names are on the file, yours and his." Eli took the card with both hands, like it weighed more than plastic. "Thank you. Use the call button if the headaches spike," she said. "Night staff already briefed." Trey crouched by Vandal near the doorway. He touched 2 fingers to the faded tattoo inside the ear, then looked the dog in the eyes. "Owen Pike," he said quietly. Vandal froze for a heartbeat, then stepped forward and pressed his head into Trey's chest. With full weight, A long, deliberate lean that made Trey close his eyes and brace one hand behind the dog's shoulders. Atlas moved in beside them and touched his muzzle to Vandal's neck, old teammates finding the same line again after years of bad paperwork and worse people. Eli watched from the threshold, one hand on the new door frame, and for the first time in months his shoulders dropped all the way down. He had not been a man refusing shelter. He had been the last guard on a fallen handler's partner, standing in sub-zero dark under a hostile name until someone who knew the work recognized the breed, read the tattoo, and answered the promise.